Hello and welcome to this podcast from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is architectural historian and television presenter Dan Cruickshank, perhaps best known for his BBC series Around the World in 80 Treasures. Dan has just published The Secret History of Georgian London, which looks at the Georgian sex industry, not so much as an end in itself, but to see how it touched all aspects of 18th century life, from the aesthetic of paintings to the built environment. In addition, Dan brings alive the stories of many of the men, and especially women, who became entangled in the sex industry, which is one of Georgian London's largest. Dan told me about the impetus behind the book.
This book really was started as an exploration to try and understand how much money was available to put into building, and it just astonished me as I explored the subject using all sorts of contemporary documentation, published sources and accounts of the Old Bailey trials and so on, just to kind of calculate that there was a gigantic amount of money, in terms of turnover, in terms of value. And in the end, I calculated about in London in the sex industry, about the late 18th century, worth about £20 million a year. Now that's a sum we have to put it in context, but it's certainly one of the biggest industries of 18th century London. The other ones that are comparable were brewing. Of course, brewing was very big. Bookselling, actually, silk trade in the first half of the 18th century, the river trades and the docks. And their values are slightly more difficult to calculate. But if you want sort of various comparisons, I suppose, in terms of values, if you just consider when the income tax came in for the first time in 1798, raising money to fight the French wars. Pitt's idea was to tax income, a terrifying novel idea. But I mean, for the first year of income tax, 1799. The total aimed at was 8 million. I mean, only 6 million was actually raised. That's nationally. And that gives you some idea, I think, of what £20 million meant in the 18th century. It was a huge amount of money. And the numbers of people involved in the sex industry are very fascinating. There's a recurring kind of estimate that from the 1750s right through to the early 19th century of 50,000 women involved in the sex industry. 50,000 is a huge number, and that's broken down in various ways, but it's a good starting point. And from those sums of money, those numbers of people, I reached my sort of estimate.
The reasons for women going into the sex industry, are they very different from the reasons that women may do that today, or are they broadly similar, would you say? I think
it's the reasons women went into it then is another world. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, in the 18th century, women, if they were intelligent and ambitious, but without any source of money, without any ability to make good connections, they didn't have inherited wealth. What did they do? They were compelled to drudge as a servant, or for example, a housemaid would earn throughout most of the 18th century about £5 a year. That's it, £5 a year. Of course, she's all is found to be lodgings and clothes and food, but £5 a year. A washwoman about 8p a day. I mean, these are, so what's this woman to do? She works at that level, or she marries and becomes subservient to her husband, or if she has spirit and ambition and she wants independence in a male-dominated world where women have no opportunities. There's no opportunities, of course, in trade or business. I mean, some women, of course, do succeed in business, it must be said, quite famously so, but they're tiny minority. Most women without access to money, without any social status, have to drudge through life, or they take a terrifying gamble, a risk, and try to be independent and have adventure and make money and have some sort of, I suppose, self-respect as individuals. And one way of doing that was the sex industry as a means to an end. I mean, many women entered it, I think, out of desperation, as a way of escape from the inevitable kind of, I suppose, grinding life that was the alternative. And the kind of the dream path of the sex industry to theatre to a proper job, to be respected, to be independent, to be a person in their own right, and then have a life. And of course, occasionally, very occasionally, it did work. There are these several famous examples. I mean, the most famous is Lavinia Fenton, who was a child prostitute, really, in Covent Garden in the very early 18th century, pimped by her mother. Kind of complicated story. I mean, so many women got into prostitution. It was accepted at the time through being seduced by men. This was the kind of, women would fall because of men, and then men, having accepted that male, I suppose, sort of lust had caused the fall of a woman, would then go on exploiting her when a prostitute. This is a ghastly reality. And this seemed to be the case with Lavinia's mother. She was to be married to a man called Bessick. He seduced her. She became pregnant. He then absconded, and she was left with a child. She had to sort of seek her fortune in the great anonymous melting pot of London. Came down with the child, married a guy called Fenton, who had a coffee house in Charing Cross. Charing Cross was a very notorious sexual area on the great sexual highway running from the Royal Exchange City via Fleet Street, the Strand, to Charing Cross. This very early years of the 18th century. And Lavinia made a life on the street in Covent Garden, selling various things, including her body, I suppose. And then a great opportunity came when the Beggar's Opera was being produced. And Mr. Rich rather fancied her singing abilities, and she was the first Polly Peachum, 1728 January, and was an instant success. And that's the cool thing about the Beggar's Opera, which I go on about some length in the book. One thing was the astonishing degree to which it was, of course, a picture of reality. Not just a challenge, of course, to the grandeur of the Italian opera by having the low life of London, singing and performing, but it was really having people like Polly, real, prostitutes on the stage. In her case, actually playing not a prostitute but Polly Peachum, but you had prostitutes playing good girls being portrayed, by prostitutes and so on. So it was interesting. So what happened in that instance is she gave this performance and was so alluring that the Duke of Bolton marries many years older than her, fell in love with her, and he did eventually marry. When his wife died, they married, and she became the Duchess of Bolton, and did indeed, escape prostitution, escape the stage as well, became respected and respectable, and died in the 1750s. So that was an example where this fantastical route did work.
But in contrast to that, you open the book with Hogarth's The Harlot's Progress, which shows perhaps the more usual expected trajectory for a woman who takes to prostitution.
Yes, I mean, it's got to be said that this gamble was a terrifying affair, because mostly girls were dogged by criminality, by abuse, by disease, of course, venereal disease, and the various other kind of consequences of trying to exist through that industry, drunkenness, cheap availability of gin until 1750s. Hogarth, of course, this is the picture he paints in The Harlot's Progress of a young woman, seduced, of course. She arrives in town from the country, picked up by Mother Needham, and then a notorious boredom procuress. The scene is, the first plate shows this scene, and she would have been taken to the bawdy house and promptly corrupted. And the second scene, of course, shows her in a rather wayward manner, already given to drink and misbehaviour. And from there, thereafter, it's sort of downhill. The path that Hogarth predicts, charts, is, I suppose, the most familiar one. From high keeping to low keeping, drunkenness, disease, low prostitute in Covent Garden, Drury Lane, sort of scene is shown, isn't it, where she's criminalised. The place is being raided by a man called Gonson, a kind of crusading magistrate intent on persecuting hapless harlots, and then she's jailed, and then she dies of venereal disease, unloved amongst nothing but corrupt clergymen who do nothing to help her. One of Hogarth's points throughout the series is how the church, in the form of various clergymen, either ignore her or abuse her. No help there, and she dies and is mourned by diseased harlots who are more interested in one indeed is more interested in groping the clergyman, another one just of inspecting her venereal disease face or getting drunk. So that's a very bleak picture. That, of course, we mustn't ever romanticize this. I mean, Hogarth is spot on, I'm sure, for most instances. This desperate gamble for independence and for escape from male domination, obviously paradoxically by being dominated by males sexually, as a prostitute, mostly ended in this, in death and disease.